The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Sometime after these events, Jesus again appeared to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he did it in this way. When Simon Peter and Thomas, the one known as the twin, were together, along with Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples, Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going to go fishing." "We'll come with you," they replied. They went down and got into the boat, but that night they didn't catch a thing. It was already getting light when Jesus appeared on the shore, but his disciples didn't recognize that it was he. "Have you caught any fish?" Jesus asked them. "No," they replied. He said to them, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat and you'll have better luck." They did as he instructed them, and now they couldn't haul it in for the huge number of fish. The disciple Jesus loved the most exclaimed to Peter, "It's the Master." When Simon Peter heard "it's the Master," he tied his cloak around himself, for he was stripped naked, and threw himself into the water. The rest of them came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. They weren't far from the land, only about 100 yards offshore. When they got to the shore, they saw a charcoal fire burning with fish cooking on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you just caught." Then Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net full of large fish ashore, 153 of them. Even though there were so many, the net still didn't tear. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat." None of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Master. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and passed the fish around as well. This was now the 3rd time after he'd been raised from the dead that Jesus appeared to his disciples. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you.
Apart from Kathleen Lyons and myself, is there anybody else in the church old enough to remember shoe polish? Really? Oh my God. Bob still uses it. Aye. You still use shoe polish?
He polishes his nails.
I polish my nails, you got it. I thought it was a thing of the past. Right. So I'm going to have to start a new homily. So I remember we had a complete ritual around polishing shoes when I was a small kid growing up in Ireland in the 1950s. It happened on a Saturday night, and we had tins of shoe polish. I don't know what you guys had here yet. You know, there was a big tin which was about 4 inches in diameter, and a small one about 2 inches, and there were screw-off tins. You had those as well? What brand did you use? Kiwi. I can't believe it. It's a small world.
After all.
Aye. So every Saturday night we had this ritual. Firstly, we had special shoes for Sunday. At some stage when we were old enough and rich enough to afford Sunday shoes, we had a special pair of shoes for Sunday Mass. And on Sunday night, you take these shoes and you'd rub off all the mud that was on them first. And then there was a little brush with 2 sides in it. You have a brush with 2 sides in it? You did? Okay. Wow, you guys are really advanced. And basically there was only, at that stage in Ireland, there was only 2 colours available. Black and brown. We're on the same page still. Oxblood, okay. Well, black and brown is what we had. You had white, ooh. Okay, liquid. But that wasn't polish. That was liquid, okay. So then you would dip in one side of the brush and you put some of this polish on your shoes, and then you took the other side of the brush and you really buffed it vigorously, really vigorously. Now I don't know if you went the next step was, if you really wanted to get a really good shine in it, more important than the brush buffing was to take newspaper and crumple it up and really work it hard with newspaper. Yeah? You got a tremendous shine. Oh yeah, this was after there was much better shine. And then the pièce de résistance was, you'd spit in it. And then with the paper, you could really, really get a good shine going up with paper and spittle. And then the shoes be arranged side by side. There'd be my father's shoes, my mother's shoes, my grandfather's shoes, my grandmother's shoes, my shoes, Seamus's shoes, Deirdre's shoes, Etna's shoes, and Porrick's shoes, all lined up in a row next to the fire on Saturday night. So I want to tell you a story that my mother told me about shoe polish. That goes way back into 1930, when Kathleen was just in her early middle age. You don't remember the 1930? So my mother, as a small child, girl of 3 and 4, they lived in County Galway, in Connemara. They lived in a little townland with a very, very romantic name. It sounds romantic in Irish. It's called Paul na Clocha. But Paul na Clocha wasn't a very romantic name when you translate it into English. It simply means the hole of the stones. Paul na Clocha was like a quarry, basically a kind of a quarry. Because it was basically just rocky bog land. That's basically what it was. But the people who lived there, the farmers who lived there, they were totally self-sufficient. And so they'd have a couple of cattle, so they'd have the milk from the cattle, they'd all churn their own butter, they'd have spuds, and they'd have vegetables, and they'd have hens, so they had their own eggs, and they'd have a few pigs, and they'd kill a pig once a year, and they'd salt it, and they'd smoke it, and they'd hang it off the rafters, and then they'd cut slices of it throughout the year. And the women always baked bread. They'd bake soda bread and currantly buns, and they'd bake at least twice a week. So my mother was a little girl of about 3 or 4, and she's visiting with her aunt, her mother's sister, after whom she was called. My mother is called Margaret, we call her Peg. So her aunt was called Margaret as well. And Margaret was teaching her how to bake. And the system in Ireland was they would bake with a kind of a griddle pot, which would be put into the fire when you'd all baked and you kneaded the dough and you'd formed the kind of bread you wanted. You'd cut a cross on the top of it. And then you put it into the griddle and put it into the fireplace and put a cover on it. And they always cooked with turf fire, peat. And so there'd be peat underneath it burning, and they'd peat on top of it. They'd put the embers on top as well, so it was baking all over. And she's teaching my mother how to do this. So at some stage, she cuts off a little piece of the dough, and my mother is kneading her own little piece of dough. She's a 3-4-year-old kid. And my grandaunt, Anne Mag, got a shoe box, the little polish box, small little one, and she gave her a section. She says, that's going to be your griddle. And so my mother bakes it, kneads it, forms it, cuts the little cross in it, puts it into the shoe box, and screws it down and sticks it into the fire. And at the end, when it's all baked, she takes out hers, and there's a little cake inside it. She takes it, cuts it in half, puts some of their own butter in it, and jam, and a big mug of tea, and she's in 7th heaven. And that's what I want to talk about today. Aunt Mag was kind of, in a sense, passing the baton to the second next generation in teaching my mother how to be self-sufficient. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to make 3 main points today. I'm going to talk about John's Eucharist. I'm going to talk about bodily resurrection. And then I want to talk about the truth of resurrection itself. What does that mean? So firstly, John's Eucharist. If you were paying attention to the gospel reading right here now, the interesting thing is that John's gospel has no account of the institution of Eucharist. Although John devotes more chapter space to the Last Supper than all of the other 3 evangelists combined. John devotes 5 entire chapters to the Last Supper, but he never mentions the institution of Eucharist at the Last Supper. The others devote very little space to the Last Supper, but a significant portion of that space is devoted to the institution of Eucharist. So if you're reading John's Gospel and you're reading the Last Supper, there is no account of the institution of Eucharist. But you found John's Eucharist hidden in 2 places in his Gospel. You find it in chapter 6 and you find it in chapter 20, the one we read today, where there are Eucharistic celebrations, but they don't involve bread and wine. Both of them involve bread and fish. And you always know when there's a Eucharist happening because there's a coded significance to it. Whenever he takes, he blesses, he breaks, and he distributes, you know you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. So when you see those 4 code words, you know Eucharist is happening. So there are 2 Eucharists happens in John's Gospel. One is in the desert, where he feeds 5,000 people with the loaves and the fishes. And the second one is today. After his resurrection, he appears to them on the beach, and they're out fishing. Seven of them are out fishing. And then they see somebody on the beach. It's early morning, they've been fishing all night long, caught nothing, and they see this figure on the beach. And John recognizes that it's Jesus. And he tells the guys, it's the Master. And Peter, being the first pope and therefore being infallible, because he was naked, he put on his clothes and then he dived into the water and swam ashore. And we've been dealing with that since. Infallible popes who make those kinds of decisions. So he comes ashore and they see that Jesus is cooking fish and he's got some bread there. And he invites them to a Eucharistic encounter. So the first point I want to make then is, Eucharist happens, it's not the elements that determine Eucharist. It's not you don't have to have bread and wine or bread and grape juice. The elements are not important. What is important is the commensality, the sharing at the same table, the notion that we're all part of God's family. That's what creates Eucharist. And Jesus impresses this upon us by using different elements at different times. It's the commensality. It is the fact that we all sit down around the table of the same Father and the same Mother. That's what makes Eucharist. That's what brings Christ consciousness among us. Now, there's a very interesting thing, I'm sure you picked up on it, that when Peter goes onto the ship to haul ashore the fish, you think he was hungry after fishing all night? He obviously wasn't that hungry because he counted them all out. There was 153 of them. Big guys, 153. Now, why was this number significant? And of course, as you might imagine, it's totally symbolic. According to Greek taxonomy at the time, there were 153 species of fish in the world. That's what they believed. Now, in fact, there are a lot more than that. We know today that is a much greater number. But they believed that there were 153 different species of fish on the planet. So it's a symbolic number that the net took in one of each species. And what would this mean? It means, obviously, that there's room in the kingdom for all of us. That no matter how many tribes are on the planet, and there are over 5,000 different tribes on the planet right now, that there's room in the net for all of us. And the interesting thing is, the comment is added, although there were so many fish and they're all big guys, the net didn't tear. So in other words, the kingdom is big enough to contain all of us. And it won't tear, because the distinctions we make between ourselves are artificial distinctions. No matter how many different cultures exist, no matter how many different linguistic groups exist, no matter how many different religions exist, no matter how many different nations exist, the kingdom is big enough to contain all of them. And no matter what we do it, we will not rend the net. We cannot rend the net of being children of God. We can't do that. So we're safe. We're in good shape. So what are some of the other symbols here then? What might the boat represent? Since this is a very symbolic encounter, what would the boat itself represent? And it seems to me it would represent the faculty to travel interdimensionally, to move among levels of reality and to move among dimensions. The ship is something that starts on land and is hauled onto the ocean, can traverse two different kinds of media. So it's a symbol of the ability to move among dimensions, which is very important in our spiritual journey. If we think that the only reality is the gross physical reality, then there is no spirituality available to us. It is the ability to travel interdimensionally that allows us to access the core of spirit itself. So that might be the symbol of the boat. And the symbol of the net would be the kingdom of God, that it contains everything. When the kingdom fishes and trawls on any planet, it pulls all sentient life form into the net. There is nothing which is not beloved of God. There is no creature that is not equally beloved of God. There is no creature who does not have a share in the Eucharistic banquet. They don't have to be human beings. They don't have to be Catholics to share in the Eucharistic banquet of Jesus. And who are the fisher folk, the fishermen? They are the great avatars, or the great spiritual teachers who come to help us to get into the net, to leave the kind of the unconscious ocean and to come into the consciousness of the kingdom. So they are the avatars among us. So when we think about that, then what does the kingdom really represent for us? It means that to be true spiritual people, we have to be both fishers and feeders. So Jesus does an interesting thing. He doesn't just give them the food he'd prepared. You can imagine that it was quite within his purview to have had enough fish and enough bread for everybody. Or if he didn't, why didn't he just multiply it like he did in John chapter 6? Why did he tell Peter, go back into the boat and get some more fish? I don't have enough. Why didn't he have enough? Why didn't he just multiply what he had? Or was it the fact that he was fishing all night and he only got one fish? Or he was baking all bread all night and he only baked one loaf? Or he went to the supermarket to buy fish and bread and then he discovered he'd left his wallet in the tomb and he didn't have enough? Why was it he didn't have enough to feed them? Again, it is very symbolic. What he's telling Peter, he's passing the baton. He's doing for Peter and the disciples what my grandaunt Mag was doing for my mother. He was giving her her little tin so that she could bake her own bread. He was teaching the apostles how to be fishers of people. So he's passing the baton for them. And so they're invited to be fishers and feeders. And that's what it means to be a spiritual person or to be a priest. And we're all meant to be priests. To be a priest, you have to be both a fisherman and a feeder. The fisherman is the male aspect of priesthood. It is the ability to go in, to dip into the mystery of life and to trawl the pearls of wisdom and of spirit. That's the fisherman aspect of priesthood. And the feeding aspect of priesthood, which is the feminine aspect of priesthood, it is to have the ability both to self-nurture and to nurture others, to be able to make others participate in this banquet. And we have to do this in very practical ways. It is not just through preaching the word. We do not feed people just by preaching the word. Every one of us has to walk our talk. We have to walk this realization into everyday life, which means we have to feed the poor in every sense of the word, not just physical food for their bodies. We have to offer them security. We have to offer them education. We have to offer them health services. We have to offer them respect. And we have to do that in the ways in which we treat them, in the kind of legislation we create, in our domestic policies and in our foreign policies. Otherwise, we do not understand what Eucharist is about. In a planet in which millions of people die of starvation every year and other people are subjected to health conditions which are unbearable, Eucharist isn't really being understood or really happening. True Eucharist is about being fisher folk and feeder folk. It is about trawling life for the wisdom of spirit and then allowing everybody else to participate in that. So that's my first point. My second point then is the bodily appearances of Jesus. What do we mean by this? For one thing, the term which is used in the New Testament, the Greek term for to appear, we don't really have an equivalent for it in English. English is not a particularly subtle language when it comes to dealing with spiritual concepts or esoteric truths. Languages like Greek or Sanskrit are much, much better at that. English is really good at technology, engineering, stuff like that. Not really good at spiritual topics. So there's no equivalent in English for the Greek verb that we translate as to appear. The sense of the Greek verb is much more that Jesus chose to make himself visible to. That's not the same thing as to appear. Appear means that if Jesus appears at the back door where Diana is sitting, and I point and say, look, there's Jesus, and everybody looks around, then we're all going to see Jesus. That's a kind of videotapable notion of appearance. That is not what the Greek verb has in mind. The Greek verb is that Jesus chose to make himself visible to. So two of us could be looking at the very same spot, and one of us is having a real encounter with Jesus, and the other isn't. Because there are two things happening there. There's the limitation of perception, and there's the limitation of our notion of body. So let me tease those asunder for a few moments. We think that perception is merely what the brain does with sensory input. And even Thomas Aquinas himself made this mistake. Thomas writes very famously in his Summa Theologica, nihil est in intellectu quod non ante fuerit in sensu. There is nothing in the intellect which is not first in the senses. So Thomas believed that everything in the intellect has to come through 5 modalities. We can see it, hear it, taste it, touch it, or smell it, and then the intellect can do a number on it. And then the belief system was, truth is found only in the judgment. It is only by critical reasoning that truth can be accessed. And the information can only come through these 5 modalities. Now, that's a very, very limiting notion of how perception works. The truth is that we access data and information in many, many different modalities besides our sensorium. Carl Jung would famously describe intuition as perception via the unconscious. So there are many other modalities in which we are receiving information which we subsequently process. So to think that perception is merely the intellectual working on sensory data is to limit ourselves unnecessarily. There are many, many, many other modalities through which we receive information. We are literally embedded in an information matrix in which the totality of the Akashic records is available to us any time when we know how to access it. So all this information is available. So the first problem with the appearances of Jesus is that we think that to have Jesus appear means that only the sensorium that can pick him up make his appearance real. That's the first limitation, and it's a very artificial limitation. And the second limitation is the notion of bodily, or bodily appearance. We're stuck in the West again with the notion that the body is WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. The body literally is just the meat and the blood and the veins, and the bone marrow. That's what body represents. Other cultures have much, much more sophisticated notions of body. So for instance, the Persians and the Egyptians both had a two-tier notion of body that was called either Ka-Ba or Ka and Fravashi in Persian. And this meant Ka represented the etheric or the kind of the spirit body, and Fravashi represented the physical body. So they're a two-tier level. You go to Greek, in which the New Testament is written, and they have a three-tier notion of body. They've got three different words for body. The first one is sarx, which means the flesh and blood body of Western medicine. And the second one is soma, which means the energy body. And the third one is pneuma, which means the spirit body. And you have to be very careful as you're reading the New Testament appearances of Jesus and the post-resurrection and Eucharist, which notion of body you're talking about. They will never use sarx. Paul says, in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, sarx cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Flesh and blood. That level of body is not what I'm talking about, he says. I'm talking about soma and I'm talking about pneuma. So part of our problem is that we don't understand that there are different levels of body. And as I said to you many times, the Hindus did it much better even than the Greeks. The Hindus had a 7-level model of body. There was the physical body that corresponds to the body of Western medicine. And then there's an etheric body, which is the energy template from which this physical body is fashioned. And then there's an astral body, which is the place of our emotions and our dream travel. And then there's a mental body, which is like Plato's ideal realm, the place in which we download data, the place of ratiocination and intellectualization and reason. And then there's a 5th level called the causal body, where we experience psychic abilities, where we're truly transpersonal, because we begin to realize we are embedded in a matrix of cosmic consciousness. And at that level we experience telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, telekinesis, precognition. All these become available to us. There's a 6th level, which is individual soul, and then there's a 7th level, which is Brahma consciousness or cosmic consciousness. And so if you now take an unlimited view of perception and put it next to a Hindu model of body, then the notion of Christ's bodily appearances are very, very different. Very different. Which is not to say, as a final caveat here in this section, that an avatar like Jesus couldn't, if he chose to do it, manifest physically. We do it ourselves. The spirit that you are, the soul that you are, took flesh in a body created from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, and you replenish this body every 7 years. Every month you replenish every single skin cell in your body. Every 6 weeks you replenish every single cell in your stomach lining. Every 6 months you replace every single cell in your skeletal system, and every 7 years you replace all the cells. So you're doing it yourself. You're manifesting and demanifesting. An avatar such as Jesus would have no problem whatsoever in manifesting a physical body if that's what he needed for an encounter. Dematerializing it if he chose, rematerializing it, bilocating it, multi-locating it, or time traveling with it. No problem whatsoever. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. It can mean that a more unlimited notion of perception is encountering a more unlimited notion of body, and then that's a real encounter. Which brings me to my third point. The truth about resurrection. You've heard me say many times that I have a very different definition of truth. For me, truth is not a correspondence, a one-on-one mapping between factoids and our representations of them. That is not truth. It's maybe factual, it's data points, it is not important. Truth for me, something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with source. That's the only definition of truth that makes sense to me. Something is true if it's transformative and it aligns me with source, then I know it's true. By this criterion, then the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are the most true thing that ever happened to disciples. You look at the disciples of Jesus who spent 3 years with him and ask yourself the question, what was the most transformative experience they had of him? It wasn't his physical body. They spent 3 years with him and they had no idea who this guy was. They were amazed. He was a really charismatic individual, obviously, but even his charismatic nature wasn't transformative for them. He was a brilliant teacher, but even his teaching didn't transform them. He was a healer and a miracle worker, but not even his healings and his miracles proved to be transformative. On the day he died, they still had no idea who he was or what he was about. The most transformative things that happened to them were the post-resurrection appearances and Pentecost. Occasions in which their perception was different and the encounter with the body of Jesus was possibly an encounter with a different level of body of Jesus. And by that definition, they were the most truthful experiences they had of him. And so when they report on their experiences, they're not making up stories to justify a young movement they're trying to start. They are people, men and women, who have been radically transformed. And if truth is that which transforms and aligns with source, ultimate truth is that which transforms radically and aligns permanently with source. These were people who had discovered ultimate truth. They were radically transformed and they were permanently aligned with this new vision, which means these were the most real experiences they ever had. You know, the extraordinary thing about when we widen the doors of perception and we understand what body really means, then we realize that this kind of experience transcends time completely. If our doors of perception are confined to our sensorium, then something is only real as long as it's happening. If you're eating an ice cream cone, it's only real as long as there's ice cream left in the cone or there's cone left under the ice cream. As soon as you've licked away all the ice cream and you've eaten all the cone, the experience is over. It's not real anymore. It's now just a memory of something that was real once. So when we confine our perceptions to our sensorium and a notion of body to a physical thing, things only happen once and then they're gone. They're just part of memory bank. When we widen our doors of perception and we understand that body is much more than just the physical body, then it is possible for us today, on the 18th of April, in the year of our Lord 2009, in the next hour, to radically experience Jesus Christ in our midst, to come into alignment with Christ consciousness just as really as they did at the Last Supper, or just as really as the 7 disciples did on the beach today. All it takes in order to encounter Christ consciousness is that we have the courage to open wider the doors of perception and to rethink what we mean by body.